Yeah, thank you very much. I should give credit to Ed Storms. Ed Storms has also contributed a great deal to lenr-canr-org over the years. Ed is the only person I know who has actually read all 2,000 documents I've studied. I have not read them all, but I have read hundreds of them, and I have drawn some conclusions from them, which I'm going to talk about today, which are fairly important. I'm going to get right into it because I want to get this done. I don't want to waste your time. Is that better? Yeah, better. Better. Okay. Cold fusion is chaotic, and that's a good thing. The literature does prove the effect is real. I'm going to insist on that. And it does teach how to replicate. And I'm going to point out some examples of that, which are very important. And this is a multidisciplinary subject, which in plain English means you better read the literature and consult with experts or your experiments will fail. And finally, the worst error you can make is the unexamined assumption, which is a very complicated thing. Let's see if I can get this to work. Did I get to cigarette? Yeah, okay, good. History shows that chaos, confusion, and doubt are normal in emergent science. They're healthy. And here's a wonderful description of them. They're Hahn and Meitner. Their early papers are a mixture of error and truth as complicated as a mixture of fission products resulting from the bombardments. Such confusion was to remain for a long time a characteristic of much of the work on uranium. We should embrace this chaos and the intellectual ferment. In plasma fusion, there is broad agreement and a solid theoretical basis, but they have not made much progress lately. And make no mistake, cold fusion is still emerging. It's still in the very early stages. It's been 24 years by the calendar, but again, comparing it to plasma fusion, this field is 2 months old. Which is to say, Uncle Sam spends, well, we've gotten roughly $50 million, and that's how much Uncle Sam spends on plasma fusion every 2 months. Okay, well, history books sanitize the past, so you don't read about the chaos if you look at the conventional books. They hide the mistakes, the disputes, the chaos, and so on that accompanied the birth of fission, aviation, and many other fields. They give you what I call the museum gallery illusion, that the past was much better than the present. What I mean is if you spend the afternoon at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you may come away with the impression that French artists in 1880 were all consummate geniuses. Not true. For every Degas or Renoir, there were dozens of third-rate artists, and they never made it into the museums, obviously. If you want great art, you have to settle for lots of bad schlock art. And if you want great science, you have to settle for lots of schlock science and also many odd people. And we'll see some examples. You need to have many great artists, or want to be great artists, ambitious young people, because you never know who's got talent. And a young person destined to do great work may not be aware of his own latent abilities. And the best example is Martin Fleischmann. Actually, when you and I knew him, he was hardworking. Long after he retired, he would get up every morning and he would spend hours in his bathrobe, his red bathrobe, puttering around, writing papers and graphing data with a pen and paper because he didn't trust computers. But he was not always like that. He was not always so diligent. And he told me his story once. He said, when I first arrived in England as a refugee, I was the laziest boy you ever saw. The laziest boy in Europe. And I found myself penniless and living in an abandoned chicken house. So I said to myself, if you don't get to work, go to school, and make something of yourself, you will spend the rest of your life living in a chicken house. So I suppose if there had been no war, Martin might have been the indolent son of a rich family all of his life. Anyway, let's see if I can get to the next slide. Oh, yeah. Well, the next issue I'd like to point out is that cold fusion is real. In September 1990, Fritz Will published a list of 92 groups with positive results. Now, I think after people such as McCubry, Storms, and Fritz Will himself published in 1990, the controversy should have ended. No other claim in the history of experimental science has been so widely replicated at such high signal-to-noise ratios, yet still not believed. Now, The papers at lenr-canr-org include, dozens of really stupid ones, mistaken ones, but there is gold underneath all of that. There is very solid proof that the effect is real. And you have to look for it, but it's there. And we have guides to it written by McCoubrey and by Storms himself. Well, Professor Heinz Gerischer was a leading electrochemist and the director of the Max Planck Institute for Physical Chemistry. He reviewed the evidence in 1991 and he concluded, a paper you can read at our site, he said, there are now undoubtedly overwhelming indications that nuclear processes take place in metal alloys. That's him on the picture there. Now, when a distinguished professor says undoubtedly overwhelming, he is shouting through a megaphone. He means it. And there are many other distinguished scientists have looked carefully at the evidence. Now, I've been in contact with hundreds of people doing lenr-canr, thousands probably. And in my opinion, most qualified experts who have read the literature carefully agree that the effect is real. Most of these so-called skeptics have not read the literature. So I will grant that science is not a popularity contest, but I think informed opinion should carry weight. Okay, well, let me get to the next topic, which is the dispute with Graham Hughes. He recently said to me that we need either more reproducibility, proof positive that a nuclear process produces the heat, or a viable model, none of which we have at present. Well, I disagree. I think we got 2 out of 3. I think the literature shows that cold fusion is more reproducible than the transistor was in the early 1950s, surprisingly. And I think the tritium and the heat correlated with helium together are proof positive that the effect is nuclear. Of course, we don't have a viable model, but as I said, 2 out of 3 is not bad. I fear that Graham means we must start over from scratch with every project to prove that cold fusion exists, like Sisyphus, pushing the rock up the hill there. If your funding agencies do not accept the proof already published by the likes of Mike McCoubrey and Ed Storms, they will not accept your proof either. So I guess you'll have to wait for Rossi to come through with this fact. Okay, well, the next topic, the next thing, as I said, not only is it real, but it has been replicated, and the literature does teach how to replicate. This is very important. A lot of people overlook it. Not only does the literature teach how to replicate, but I am going to teach you in the next 5 minutes how to replicate. Now, there's many valuable papers about this, but I like these 3 listed right here, which is Miles' Anomalous Effects in Deuterated Systems, Craven's ICCF-4, and finally Storms' How to Produce the Pons-Fleischmann Effect. The Miles paper is a masterpiece and very famous because it teaches, I think the main reason people think it's so great is because it shows the correlation between helium and heat. But when I read it, what grabbed my attention is right here in table 10. And this compares the performance of palladium from different sources. And it shows that the material is the key, it's critical to success. I don't know how you work the laser pointer, but look at the top there. The NRL material was pretty good. Johnson Matthey in the middle was the best, and the miscellaneous sources on the bottom did not work. Okay, so let me zoom in on Johnson Matthey. Yeah, okay, that's pretty good. The ones in red there. These 3 worked spectacularly well, producing 3 to 15 watts per cubic centimeter, which is about 10 times better than the others. Now this notation, JMFP, means Johnson Matthey palladium provided by Fleischmann and Pons. Fleischmann handed over the cathodes, the 2 cathodes to Miles. And I mean, he physically put them in his hand. Johnson Matthey gave Miles the other one from the same stock. So Miles told me that this was the best palladium he ever used. He told me that a month ago. So at one of the conferences, I went up to Martin and I asked him about it. So here's our conversation, as I recall it many, many years later. Me. Mel says, you gave him the cathodes that worked so well. Martin, yes. I handed out many samples to Mel and to others. And here's the thing. When Uncle Martin gives you palladium, it works. When other people give you palladium, it doesn't work. What does that tell you? Me, the straight guy. It tells me that the secret is in the material. So how did you know what material to use? Martin: I didn't know. I asked my friends at Johnson Matthey. He often did things in a convoluted way, but in this case, he asked the people at Johnson Matthey. He told them he wanted to load palladium to very high levels, and they recommended the palladium that they had developed in the 1930s for hydrogen filters. And lo and behold, the people at BARC and NASA later used that material inside of Milton Roy hydrogen filters, purifiers, and they reported it worked very well. So there you go. So that's how you replicate. That's the first step. You start with recommended palladium. Then you prepare it by various methods such as polishing the surface and doing electrolysis at low power to condition the metal. Now when Fleischmann and Pons went to France to work with Toyota, they improved their methods of preparation. The methods were hush-hush secret. But we know what they are because at ICCF-18, Dennis Cravens described them. He described his own methods, and then Fleischmann stood up and said, "That's my favorite paper." Dennis revealed our secrets. That's just what we do. So if you want to learn how to prepare the palladium, you read Cravens. And this brings us to the third paper. I have to go back. The one by Ed Storms, how to perform the Fleischmann-Pons experiment. This teaches how to recognize good material and how to winnow it out. That is, separate the good from the bad. The study began when Tanaka Precious Metals sent Ed 90 foil cathodes. And Ed devised a series of tests to separate the good ones from the bad ones. And also methods to coax them into working even better. And these methods include some of the ones that Cravens described: polish to a mirror finish, wash with acetone, after washing, do not touch with fingers or tissue paper. Remember that, that's important. And load slowly. Well, Ed also described several ways to test the cathode as he went along. For example, he wanted to know if it was swelling up, expanding. So, and he looked for cracks under the microscope, and he also used a handheld micrometer gadget like this on the foil to measure the how much it had swollen before and after initial loading. And he rejected palladium that swells more than 2%. Well, Ed tested the 90 cathodes, and he found four that worked, that passed all the tests. And after they passed the test, these 4 produced robust heat. They worked repeatedly. So is that a 4% success rate or a 100% success rate? You be the judge. I think that's a stupid debate myself. But it took Ed about a year to go through all of these 90 samples and do all of his tests. So I said I would show you how to replicate cold fusion. I did not say it was easy. But it can be done if you follow the instructions, which very few people do. Well, anyway, they went to France, and their work, Fleischmann and Pons' work in France, culminated. Well, they used Johnson Matthey palladium the whole time, and they used the techniques described by Cravens, and it culminated in spectacular results shown here. In experiment 3, they got 294 megajoules of excess energy at 101 watts. In experiment 4, they got 250% excess. It's astounding results. These results might have been the making of cold fusion. They might have convinced the whole world that the effect is real. Alas, the opportunity was squandered. The project collapsed, I was told, because of greed and politics. Most unfortunate. That rock rolled down the hill. It's a recurring theme in this field. Things start well and then they go off the tracks because of human emotions for the most part. After Martin retired, he and I tried to buy some of the hydrogen filter palladium. Johnson Matthey told us they had changed the method of manufacturing it. They offered to make us a kilogram of the older material for $50,000. Which was a very good deal, actually. But Martin and I did not have that kind of money, so we asked several other researchers if they would like to go in with us. But no one expressed interest. Now, by that time, Violante was learning how to make reliable cathodes. Now, I suppose that Violante is gradually rediscovering secrets that Johnson Matthey has known for 80 years. Yet another rock, another hill. Uncle Martin did not get a chance to hand out more palladium, and we never found out whether other people could replicate those spectacular results from France. And also, I'm sorry to say, the first study by Melvin Miles also ended badly. When the Navy found out what he was up to, they demoted him from being Distinguished Fellow of the Institute to a menial job as a stockroom clerk. So he retired. All this is in the lenr-canr archives. His letters to his boss and things like that are all there. Okay, let's see which one we have. Srinivasan. This is great. Well, continuing our tour of the dark side here, let me look at some what you might call a partial success and then a failed experiment. Now, there's hundreds like this in the literature on lenr-canr-org, hundreds of bad experiments. It's not pleasant reading them, but you should try to understand what went wrong. You can learn from that. And let's look at two examples, Srinivasan and Kamio-Kande. Now, the people at BARC did many fine experiments. They produced definitive results, especially with palladium. It was very good. The results with nickel light water are puzzling, and they're a mixture of success and failure. Srinivasan did 3 tests, Series 1 at BARC, 1992. This produced excess heat and tritium. And then in 1994, he went to SRI and tried to replicate the first series. And he spent 6 months of effort and concluded finally that the excess heat was caused by recombination. He admitted it was a mistake, which is a noble failure and great scientific integrity. And then Series 3, he went back to India in 1996. In this series of tests, they made no attempts to measure heat, only tritium. And tritium was again detected, but not at levels as high as the first series. And the bottom shows what else they found, which is fascinating. The tritium kept vanishing, like in a sawtooth fashion. The authors wrote, "A close scrutiny of our sampling, distilling, and counting techniques confirms that the decrease in tritium level is genuine and not attributable to any artifact. So we are strongly tempted to suggest that there is an as yet unidentified mechanism periodically cleansing the electrolyte of tritium." Well, it's confusing. The results are very similar to Hahn and Meitner's in the 1930s. It's a mixture of oddball stuff that doesn't make sense. The literature is full of weird results like this one. Now, they cannot all be right, but unless you have a magic touchstone, you can't tell which is right and which is wrong. Their theory is no guide. Now, this is very frustrating. It's what turns a lot of people off about this field, but I think it's wonderful. I love it. And this is one of my favorite parts about cold fusion, and I'll bet that you don't see stuff like that at a plasma fusion conference. That's all I can say. Well, moving on to one that was more of a complete failure. Kamio-Kande. It's a huge facility in Japan. It's the best detector in the world. And indeed, the particle detection was superb. Unfortunately, electrochemistry was treated as an afterthought, and there are many experiments like this. In 1991 and 92, they did 2 sets of tests, using a total of 50 cells, including gas-loaded ones, electrochemical ones, and Portland cement made with heavy water. I have a graduate thesis by Ishida, which devotes 120 pages of loving detail to the particle detection, but 2 pages about electrochemistry. And basically, the only thing it says is that, quote, "the whole preparation of electrolytic cells was entrusted to groups from BYU and Texas A&M." Well, I have not found a published description of the electrochemistry in the literature. But years after the test, I spoke with American and Japanese electrochemists who heard about the project. And this is what they told me, and I think it's some of it's well documented. Texas A&M did send instructions along with the cells, i.e. what voltage to use, how to prepare the cathodes, and so on. The researchers at Kamio-Kande ignored these instructions. All the cells were run on the same circuit, even though the anodes and the cathodes were of different sizes and shapes. The cells were initially wired in series until one of them failed and they all went out. So then they went out and rewired them in parallel. The cells were run at high voltage from the very beginning because the researchers wanted to get on with the experiment quickly. You're supposed to gradually ramp up, as I said 3 times. Cravens and Storm said that. Many people have said that. Well, the researchers were shown on NHK, national television, pulling out a cathode with their bare fingers, waving at the camera like this, and then putting it back. Well, this contaminates the cathode. The Japanese electrochemists watching this on TV were aghast. That's the best word I can find. Again, Craven, Storms, or any electrochemist would have warned them not to do that. Finally, they employed no diagnostics other than the search for neutrons. They did not attempt to measure excess heat or loading or anything else. And they did not ask Mesono or any other electrochemist to assist them. Well, to summarize, from an electrochemist's point of view, these people were trying to tune a piano with a sledgehammer. Mike McCubey described this experiment as a prolificate squandering of resource and opportunity. He said, with a little more thought and care, a little less hubris, and the inclusion of just one electrochemist, this could have been a critical one-off experiment. And Ikegami said this is fishing in a dry hole. In other words, it's unlikely that any of the cells produced a cold fusion effect. Now, I'm not picking on the Kamiokande people so much. There are dozens of experiments like this, including some of the most important so-called critical experiments in 1989 from leading institutions. The key lesson is read the textbooks, read the literature, consult with experts. Most of the failed experiments in the literature went off the tracks because the researchers did not do their homework. It really is that simple. You don't look for any deep reason. It's because they didn't know what they were doing, and they didn't bother to ask anyone. Well, as I said before, Fleischmann asked Johnson Matthey to recommend palladium. John Bacchus once told me, he said, I'm not an expert in calorimetry, so I scouted out the best expert in Texas and asked him to visit our lab. And he came and he looked at the apparatus and the data, and then he laughed. And he said to me, you don't need me. Anyone can measure that much heat. Well, if Fleischmann and Bacchus feel comfortable asking other people for help, you should too. They were the best electrochemists in the 20th century, for crying out loud. Well, okay, one last lesson and then I'll let you go. The most egregious, as I said, the most egregious error you can make is not doing your homework. Just, plow ahead without doing your homework. The most pernicious, difficult to catch error is the unfounded assumption. That is to say, an assumption so widely held by so many people that it's taken for granted, and no one notices it's wrong. And I have a really fascinating example here from the history of biology. There was a half-century struggle to understand or to determine where the genetic code is stored. Now, by 1900, people knew the laws of genetics. They had learned them from observations of fruit flies and other species. And it's amazing how much depth they had. It's astounding. In 1916, one textbook said, we may reasonably suppose that in the chromosomes is found the material basis of every inherited character. And furthermore, it says, there was one particular characteristic that is probably governed by two different genes which may be in different chromosomes. They knew a terrific amount. They knew a lot, but they also knew the limits of their knowledge. They emphasized, textbooks emphasized that they did not know the physical nature of the gene and they were speculating about it. And they wanted to know. That was the big open question in biology. And it went on for 50 years being open. The first question was, are the genes stored in proteins, carbohydrates, or the nucleic acid? Most experts concluded that it must be in proteins. And why did they say that? Because protein is complex and varied. The acid was ruled out repeatedly because it seemed, quote, too simple, and too boring. There's only 4 bases, To put this in modern terms, which wouldn't make any sense. People didn't have any sense of this back then. But to put it in modern terms, people thought that complex information has to be stored in complex data storage mediums. Now, from our point of view, the notion that the acid is too simple sounds kind of comical. Why? Because we are used to binary data storage in simple repetitive structures. And we live in a sea of information. Our computers store more bytes of data than there are grains of sand on all of the beaches of the earth. That's how much data we've got nowadays. So we are quite used to simple structures. Now, there was some mechanical data storage back when this controversy was raging back in the 1930s. There was IBM punch cards. Now, most people never encountered such things and had no feel for them. I doubt it would have occurred to a biologist in 1930 to consult with an IBM punch card engineer. Wide-ranging cross-disciplinary collaboration is a great thing. We all love that. But you have to have some idea who you want to collaborate with and why. Now, I don't think we know who that is in our case either. Other people know the answers to our questions, but we don't know who those people are, and they've never heard of us. So that's the problem there. Now, this complicated storage hypothesis, as I said, it was a hypothesis. It had no basis in biology. It just kind of drifted in through a window and settled in people's minds. Now, are there similar, phantom, unfounded notions holding back progress in cold fusion? Well, John Bockris said, the Coulomb barrier is a shibboleth. It's a myth. It doesn't exist. That's what he said. You can be the judge of that. Most skeptics, many skeptics anyways, believe that all cold fusion reactions must produce a gigantic flux of neutrons, as you know. This belief is well grounded in plasma fusion theory, unlike the complicated storage idea in biology. But whether it's well grounded or not, once the experiments prove there is no giant flux of neutrons, everyone should have put that belief aside. It has become an unquestioned assumption. It has become a shibboleth. Now, are we, the people in this room, are we making similar dogmatic mistakes? Now, I couldn't tell. I have no idea because I would be as blind to them as you are. But I caution you to be careful about things like that. Because over and over again in the history of science, you find out that something that held back a field for years and years and years was a completely unfounded assumption. Not even tested. You know, there's no experimental data at all indicating it, but yet people believed it. Okay, well, let me close with back to the history of biology and the chaos that's so characteristic of science in the early stages here. By the mid-1940s, they concluded that the gene is in the nucleic acid after all. But they were still floundering around trying to figure out the structure of DNA. When along came James Watson, who was another lazy young man like Martin Fleischmann in The Chicken House. By his own account in his book, Watson said he was always ready to cut corners and goof off. And now, a year before he made his discovery, he attended a conference in Italy because he said the weather was so much nicer than England. That's what he said. And let's see if I can get to that screen here. He described a picture of emergent science and the many odd people it attracts. And this may make you feel better about our conferences, or not. I'm going to read the whole thing because it's simply hilarious, but it's very, very well described. Much of the talk about the three-dimensional structure of proteins and nucleic acids was hot air. Though this work had been going on for over 15 years, most, if not all, of the facts were soft. Ideas put forward with conviction were likely to be the products of wild crystallographers who delighted in being in a field where their ideas could not be easily disproved. Thus, though virtually all biochemists were unable to understand the arguments of the X-ray people, there was little uneasiness. It made no sense to learn complicated mathematical methods in order to follow baloney. Thank you.
Well, Jed, thanks so much, and I also want to just publicly acknowledge and thank Jed for his excellent work in terms of the archive.
And Ed Storms, too.
And Ed Storms, yes. So thank you.